You've got to love working in this place. I arrive here about an hour before the show because it takes about an hour for makeup to try and make me look semi-decent at least. And I dumped my extensive research on the table. Thank you very much, Jabu, our floor manager, who immediately picked it up, crumpled it up, and threw it away. I had to go and find it in a rubbish bin, and it's now useless to me, so we'll throw that away. And welcome John Saker, a partner in the Africa Advisory Practice section of KPMG. We're talking business in Africa. Now that I've thrown the notes away, we'll have to just take the conversation somewhere else. How is doing business in Africa?
Good evening, Jeremy. Just as well you've thrown your notes away because there's probably nothing in there that could help you.
Oh, okay, beautiful.
Business in Africa is a very exciting place to be. The rest of the world, particularly the Northern Hemisphere asset managers, have had to look somewhere else in the world since 2007 in order to put their cash. And they've found Africa. So in a way, the silver lining of the real economic crisis, credit crunch in the Northern Hemisphere in 2007 has found Africa. And there's a tremendous opportunity being recognized across the north, south, east, west of Africa into the future.
What sort of, realistically, if I'm sitting in Switzerland and I'm earning 0.01% of interest in my Swiss bank account, what sort of returns am I realistically looking at in Africa?
Well, I guess you want to get a return better than the gross domestic product of Africa as a continent or of a particular destination in Africa. Yes, around about 3.5% or so in Southern Africa or South Africa, but double that generally across the continent on average, particularly in some of the petroleum-based economies like Nigeria and Angola. But it's well recognized that gross domestic product improvement across Africa is between 5 and 10% on average. I've seen figures of about 7.5, moving on to 8%.
That's a good return.
Very good return. And so you need to, for the man in the street, you need to find an investment vehicle that will get you into Africa and give you that type of return.
We'll come back to how you can, as you and I, invest in Africa. But let's look at the negatives and the positives. What's holding Africa back at the moment from an investment point of view?
Well, the rest of the world has been Afro-pessimistic for decades and decades for various historical legacy reasons. So a continuation of that Afro-pessimism would be a holding back of Africa. So the likes of you and I, and in programs like this, we need to disseminate information about the opportunities in Africa so as to dissolve some of that Afro-pessimism that has been prevalent. It is, of course, turning to optimism as all of the major financial institutions, World Bank, and all of the international banking groups increasingly develop their footprint across Africa. And as trade increases, both ends of it, the sending organization and the receiving organization, as that continues, there's going to be a dissolving of that Afro-pessimism.
You were saying your company, before we started the show, you threw a number around something like 6 out of 10 clients.
Yeah, we did a survey
of offices in Africa.
We did a survey of KPMG's 1,000 largest clients, and we found that 6 out of 10 of them have businesses in many places in Africa. So, if a Big Four accounting and auditing firm has clients across the width and breadth of Africa to the extent that 6 out of 10 of its largest clients, largest 1,000 clients, have businesses in Africa, that's really got to be a good indication that business is moving to Africa, is there already, and has been very successful in doing it.
Another negative has got to be the infrastructure situation in Africa.
No doubt. So the infrastructure development of Africa has got to be addressed. I think the international funding organizations are increasingly providing financial assistance for the development of infrastructure. That's sanitation, water, urban development, broadcasting, roads, bridges, harbors and ports. And I think if you look at the Africa Infrastructure Fund and have a look at their annual report, you'll see that the infrastructure development across Africa continues without break, with further requirements. There are any number of international airport management companies operating in Africa, any number of road building organizations across Africa being funded in different ways, either on private public partnerships or by bilateral support from international funding organizations to governments, and any number. And that has got to be the big development into the future, because governments need to create an environment where businesses can thrive. Thriving businesses create employment, increasing numbers, and that has got to be part of the development in Africa.
China's got to be a big part of this.
Yeah, China's got its role to play. China's a large consumer of African resources, and in order to get those resources to China, there needs to be infrastructure, roads and railways and ports and the like. And so China has been funding those, and that's good for Africa that this infrastructure development is happening. In this case, it's for a particular purposes, export of natural resources. So that's good, definitely.
But isn't there an argument that the infrastructure that is being put in place by people like the Chinese investors in Africa is only being put in place because it suits what they need to do it for? So you may have a tarred road that goes from a mine to a coastal port, but that's not necessarily the tarred road that you really need.
Absolutely correct. It might not be the tar road that you need, but before there was a tarred road, there wasn't a road, or there was an impassable road, or a very difficult road to travel. But there is now a road, and a road does provide for infrastructure development along the road. There's no doubt about it. So that's good. It's not complete. It's not everything one would wish for. So perhaps you're hinting that governments who negotiate these arrangements for China to buy Africa natural resources need to be spending on other infrastructure projects. Yes, and the typical one is sports stadiums and hospitals. And so the whole policy of selling to China in a particular way does provide for infrastructure development. Yes, it doesn't answer all the infrastructure needs, but it is a development.
Let's get back to the individual now. I like Africa. I think it's a great proposition, and I think I can make some money. How do I invest in Africa?
Well, first of all...
There was a long pause there.
Yeah. First of all, the individual is looking to do that, needs to educate himself or herself regarding the opportunities in Africa. There is a plethora of information available by cruising the web about Africa opportunities in natural resources, in telecommunications, in infrastructure development. So I think the individual needs to do their homework as to which parts of Africa and in which sectors the opportunities are. Then the individual needs to look at which companies operate in those sectors and what are their projects. Is it a gold mining company? Is it a retail organization? Is it a telecommunication company? And those are the sectors that I'm suggesting might offer good returns at this stage. Is it a logistics company at this stage? Would that be a real opportunity for investment in a South African stock exchange in a company that has a good African footprint? So I think that's the way the South African investor or an investor in Nigeria or wherever, rest of the world, might want to find a company that has a good footprint in Africa in a sector that the investor desires to be in.
If I gave you 1,000 Rand now and said to you, invest that on my behalf in Africa, where do you reckon, what do you reckon you'd go for?
Well, I think that's, there's so many choices that this investor with your gifted 1,000 Rand, how about $1,000, Jeremy? We could get a much better return.
Listen, I work in media. Okay, I can only afford 1,000 Rand, unfortunately.
Well, let's talk about media for that. I think across Africa, telecommunications has got to be on the upside. 400 million cell phone users in Africa, but with a population of nearing 1 billion. So the penetration is good, but not nearly saturation. So I think telecommunications has got to be one of the primary ones. Secondly would be gold mining, particularly in West Africa, a company with a good footprint in the gold mining industry. Gold price is pretty good. New mining starts in West Africa.
Who's working West Africa in gold mines?
I would suggest that virtually all the international mining houses have operations somewhere between DRC and West Africa, let alone their normal footprint. So in terms of new mining starts, I would perhaps that would be the research for the investor: who's investing, who's building new mines, who's post the exploration stage, where in Africa. So natural resources has got to be a pretty good option in this case. And then, of course, the retailers, the logistics companies, the food distributors, the distribution companies, the retailers have got to be a good option in this regard. One just needs to look at the European retailers' investments in Africa, as well as the South African retailers in the rest of Africa. And I think an investor would get pretty convinced that that's got to be a good option as well.
Speaking about retailers, we've seen the recent deal go through, which has now been disputed by 3 government departments between Walmart and Massmart. Is South Africa still the gateway to Africa, or is that starting to swing towards Nigeria?
I would suggest that as Africa develops, as the policies and procedures get implemented and development happens, that South Africa won't be regarded in the future as the only gateway. Clearly into North Africa, Egypt, and all the other states following the Arab Spring have got to be opportunities in those large markets, especially in the post-conflict environments. Nigeria for West Africa has got to be an excellent springboard to West Africa, and of course South Africa. So I don't think South Africa will be unique into the future. It has been in the past. But as more and more people, investors, asset managers discover more about Africa and learn more about Africa and dissolve their Afro-pessimism, I think there will be other points of entry for opportunities in Africa.
Now, you mentioned North Africa, you mentioned West Africa, you mentioned Southern Africa. You didn't mention East Africa.
Well, East Africa is probably a more mature market than most people realize.
Okay.
There is a union in East Africa, the East African Parliament, and there is a customs union. Also, East Africa is a member of the preferential trade arrangements. So there are quite a few overlapping trade arrangements for East Africa. East Africa is not an undeveloped market. It might well be underdeveloped. And I think we will see in the future the benefits of the Common Customs Union for the 3 main countries in East Africa. It is, I would perhaps you want to call it in the current terminology, a second world environment. But there are many opportunities there, some of which have been realized over the past number of decades. So I think the upside in development in East Africa is good, but perhaps in other parts of Africa there's a lower base. So investors generally would like to start off a lower base than perhaps a more mature base.
We continue talking about doing business in Africa and try and find out where the investments are, which are the countries to start looking at, and which businesses you could get involved in as an investor. Don't go anywhere, we'll be back in just a moment.